My son looked me in the eyes and called me useless. 15 people heard him say it. They smiled. Some even clapped. I picked up my coat, grabbed my keys and drove home. 2 hours later I was packing everything into my car. The next morning I was driving toward Miami with nothing but 2 suitcases and anger that could light up an entire city. Where are you watching from? Write your city in the comments and click that subscribe button. Let me explain how I ended up hearing those horrible words. 6 weeks before this happened, my husband, Thomas, died in a car accident. He was only 57 years old. We had built Carter Family Bakery together for 30 years. It started as one small shop and grew into 15 stores across 3 states. Everyone thought our son Brian would become the new boss. He was 28 and had worked in the bakery since college. I should have noticed the warning signs earlier. Brian started making decisions without asking me. He would laugh when I suggested new recipes or store ideas. He treated me like I didn't understand anything about running a business I helped create before he was even born. But I was so sad about losing Thomas. My heart hurt every single day. So I didn't fight back. I thought Brian was just nervous about his new job. Maybe he felt scared and didn't know how to show it. Thomas had always planned to teach Brian slowly over many years. But death doesn't wait for anyone. The day everything changed, Brian called a big meeting. He said he wanted to talk about the future of the bakery. I arrived early like I always did, wearing my favorite blue dress and the ring Thomas gave me on our 15th wedding anniversary. I thought I was going to help make important decisions. I was wrong. The moment I walked into that room, something felt strange. Our lawyer Mike wouldn't look at me. Susan, who runs our biggest store, kept playing with her phone. Even Rita, who has worked with us for 20 years, stared down at her papers. Brian stood at the front of the room in an expensive suit, looking very proud and confident. "Good morning, everyone," he said with a big smile. "I've asked you all here because we need to make some big changes." He turned on his computer and a presentation appeared on the wall. The first slide said making our bakery better and stronger. I sat down in my chair, thinking we would talk about new products or maybe opening more stores. But Brian started talking about getting rid of things that slow us down. He used big words that didn't make much sense. He talked about removing obstacles and bringing in fresh ideas. For 15 minutes, he danced around what he really wanted to say. Then he showed a slide that made my stomach hurt. The slide said, "People who cost money but don't help." My name was right at the top. "As you can see," Brian continued in a voice that sounded like a teacher talking to children, "we have some people here who don't actually make the bakery better. Some folks are here because we feel bad for them, not because they do good work." Then he said the words I will never forget. "Time to get rid of the useless weight. Starting with my mother." The room filled with awkward laughter. Not mean laughter exactly, but the kind of sound people make when they don't know what to do. But it felt like someone had slapped me across the face. I sat there trying to understand what just happened. My own son had called me useless in front of people I trained and helped and worked beside for years. People who came to Thomas's funeral and cried with me. The old Catherine would have stood up and argued. She would have reminded everyone in that room about the recipes she created. The customers she helped every single day. The 30 years of hard work that built everything Brian was now standing on. She would have fought to keep her place. But the woman who stood up that day was someone completely new. I didn't say anything at all. I just gathered my coat and purse, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the door. When I reached the doorway, I turned around one last time. "Brian," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "I hope you remember this day when you understand what you just lost." Then I left. Not just the meeting, not just the building, but my whole life as I knew it. That's when I realized something important. Had 2 choices: stay and beg for respect from people who clearly didn't value me, or leave completely and build something new where nobody knew me as Thomas Carter's wife or Brian Carter's mother. Can you guess which one I picked? Putting your whole life into 2 suitcases teaches you what really matters. Turns out what mattered to me fit into my car's trunk. Everything else was just expensive stuff I had been keeping around thinking it made me important. I had exactly 3 hours between leaving that meeting room and getting on the road. 3 hours to close one chapter and start another. Most people would say that's crazy. Called it smart. My house felt different when I got back. Like it belonged to a stranger now. Thomas's coffee mug still sat on the counter. Family photos on the walls showed a woman who smiled too much and never asked for what she deserved. I looked at that woman and felt sorry for her. First, I called Rita, the employee who looked most uncomfortable during Brian's speech. "Catherine," she answered right away. "Are you okay? What happened back there was terrible." "Rita," I interrupted. "I need you to do something. For me. And please don't ask questions." Silence. "Hey. What do you need?" "I need you to send me our recipe book. The one with all my original recipes that I created." Another silence, this time longer. "Catherine, you know I shouldn't do that." "Rita," I said in a voice I'd never used with her before. "I hired you when you couldn't find work anywhere. I taught you everything about baking. Stayed late so many nights to help you succeed. I'm not asking you to steal. I'm asking you to email me recipes that I invented." More silence. "Then give me your email address. You'll have it in 15 minutes. Next, I called my bank. George Stevens had been helping me with money for 12 years. He knew our family very well. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "I heard about Thomas. I'm so very sorry." "Thank you, George. I need to change some things with my accounts right now." "Course. What can I help with?" "I want to move all my money to a different bank. I want all my mail sent to a new address. And I want Brian removed from any list that lets him see my information." The silence told me everything. News traveled fast in our small town. "Mrs. Carter, are you sure this is the right time? Sometimes when people are sad, they make choices they regret later." "George," I said, cutting him off. "I have never been more sure of anything. How fast can you do this? If you come to the bank in the next hour, we can finish most of it today." While I was at the bank, I stopped at the clothing store and bought what I called my new life clothes. Not the boring dresses and flat shoes I'd been wearing forever, but clothes that showed who I really was underneath all that polite behavior. Flowing skirts, bright shirts in colors that made me happy, boots that had personality. The woman helping me, an older lady named Marie, looked at me with curiosity. "New job?" she asked. "Knew everything," I answered, handing her my credit card. By 5 o'clock I was in my car with 2 suitcases, my laptop bag, and a full tank of gas heading toward Miami. I chose Miami for one simple reason. It was as far from our small Virginia town as I could drive while staying in the country. Different weather, different people, different everything. As I drove away, my phone kept buzzing with calls from Brian. The first few I ignored. Then came the text messages. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk about this. You're being ridiculous. Come home so we can fix this like adults. Rita told me you took the recipe book. That belongs to the company." I turned off my phone without answering. The old Catherine would have felt guilty for making him worry. The new Catherine figured Brian made his own bed when he called his mother useless in front of everyone. At a rest stop 3 hours into my drive, I bought coffee from a cheerful young woman who couldn't have been older than Brian. "Running away from something?" she asked as she handed me my cup. I thought about that question as I got back on the highway, watching Virginia disappear in my rearview mirror. Running toward something, I finally decided. During the long drive to Miami, I did something I hadn't done in years. Let myself imagine a completely different life. Not as Thomas Carter's wife or Brian Carter's mother, but as Catherine Carter, a woman whose story was just beginning. I stopped at a hotel in Georgia that night and pulled out my laptop to do what any smart businesswoman does before entering unknown territory. Research. Miami's restaurant scene was exploding. Small food businesses were popping up everywhere. The city was full of people from different countries who missed food from their home. The cost of living was higher than Virginia, but the weather was beautiful, and the culture welcomed people starting over. By the time I fell asleep that night, I had a plan forming, not just for surviving, but for something bigger. Something that would make Brian's little power play look like a child throwing a tantrum. When I finally arrived in Miami 2 days later, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about what comes next. The woman who left Virginia was carrying pain and sadness. The woman who arrived in Florida was ready to discover what she could really do. That first night in a hotel room overlooking the ocean, I ordered room service and raised my glass of wine to my reflection in the window. Here's to finding out what useless weight can do when it stops holding other people up, I said to myself. For the first time in months, I smiled. A real smile. Finding a place to live in Miami was easier than finding myself. But both happened faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, I was living in a small apartment near the beach with big windows and the kind of sunshine that made me feel alive again. The woman who helped me find the apartment was named Linda Gomez. She was full of energy and life. She looked at my background check and bank statements with interest. Baker from Virginia looking for a fresh start, she said, reading my application. We get lots of people like that here. Miami calls to folks who need to become someone new. Is it that obvious? Yes. Linda laughed. Honey, I've been selling apartments for 15 years. You have that look. The look of someone who just figured out they were living someone else's dream instead of their own. She was right. Everything about Miami felt like permission to be different. The music coming from every restaurant. The food trucks on every corner. The way strangers smiled and said hello instead of rushing past with their heads down. My apartment came with basic furniture, which was perfect since I left everything in Virginia except my clothes and a few pieces of jewelry Thomas gave me. I kept his wedding ring on a chain around my neck. Not because I couldn't let go, but as a reminder that I had been brave enough to love deeply once and could be brave again. The first thing I did after moving in was buy a good oven. Not a fancy expensive one like Brian had insisted we needed for the bakery, but a simple reliable oven that reminded me of the early days when Thomas and I baked in our tiny apartment kitchen, dreaming of building something special. While my first batch of bread baked on my second morning in Miami, I did something that would have shocked the old Catherine. I opened my laptop and started planning my comeback. Not the angry emotional kind that would make me look desperate, but the smart business kind that would make Brian wish he'd kept his mouth shut. I looked through the recipe book Rita had sent me and started thinking about patterns. Carter Family Bakery had built its success on one thing: taking old family recipes from different cultures and making them perfect. We were the bakery people visited when they wanted bread that tasted like home. Bread that brought back memories of childhood and family and love. The funny thing was that nearly all those special recipes had been created by me. Not supervised by me. Not approved by me. But actually invented by me in late-night baking sessions and weekend experiments. I had been the one testing flavors and adjusting ingredients. I had been the one talking to customers about what they missed from their grandmother's kitchen. I had been the one turning memories into reality. Brian knew how to sell my bread. But did he know how to create it? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Unknown Florida number. Catherine Carter, I answered using my full name. For the first time in forever. Mrs. Carter, this is Rosa Martinez from Martinez Cafe. I got your number from Linda Gomez. She said you might be interested in baking work. I almost dropped my coffee cup. I hadn't told Linda I was looking for work. What kind of baking? We run a small Cuban cafe, but we want to expand our bread selection. We need someone who understands both traditional baking and can create new things. Linda said you had experience with exactly this. 3 days later, I stood in Martinez Cafe's tiny kitchen looking at equipment that was older than my son. Rosa Martinez was a passionate woman in her 50s with the kind of energy that builds dreams or burns them down depending on the day. Her cafe was small but always full of customers. The problem was simple. She made amazing Cuban food but bought boring bread from a big supplier. My family has been asking for better bread for 2 years, Rosa explained, showing me her cramped workspace. But every baker I hire either can't make what I need or wants too much money. I spent the next 3 hours doing what I'd done for 30 years at Carter Family Bakery. asking questions, understanding what customers really wanted, and designing solutions that would work in the real world with real equipment and real budgets. The problem wasn't complicated. Rosa needed someone who could make traditional Cuban bread plus other varieties that would appeal to her diverse customer base. But she needed it done in a kitchen the size of a closet with an oven from 1985. "Here's what I can do," I told Rosa as the sun set outside her cafe window. "I'll create a rotating menu of 6 bread types. Traditional Cuban bread. Plus 5 other varieties that use the same basic dough but different flavoring and shaping. We can make everything in your current kitchen with your current oven." Rosa looked at me like I'd just performed magic. "How long would that take to set up?" 2 weeks for recipe testing. 1 week for training your staff," I said, gathering my notes. "It's not complicated, but it requires someone who understands how to make quality food in imperfect conditions. Would you be willing to do this?" Rosa asked. "My rate is $25 an hour plus 5% of any increase in bread sales. During the first 3 months." Rosa didn't hesitate. "When can you start?" Walking out of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Thomas died. Professional joy. Not the tired satisfaction of doing the same thing for years, but the real excitement of building something new from the ground up. That evening I called Linda Gomez to thank her. "How did you know I was looking for work?" I asked. "Honey," she laughed, "I didn't know for sure. But I've helped enough people start over to recognize someone with skills who just needs a chance. Besides, Rosa's been searching for someone with your background for months." As I hung up, I realized something important had changed. For the first time in years, someone recommended me for who I was. Not who I was married to or related to. The old Catherine had always been introduced as Thomas's wife or Brian's mother. The new Catherine was being hired as Catherine Carter, the woman who could solve problems other people gave up on. That night, I opened a bottle of cheap wine from the corner store and called it a celebration. Not just for landing my first job, but for discovering that 30 years of experience don't disappear just because someone calls you useless. In fact, I was starting to think that useless weight, when properly used, could become the foundation for something stronger than whatever Brian thought he was building without me. Success in Miami started small and spread like wildfire, which made sense because everything in Florida seemed to come with extra heat. Within 4 months, I went from 1 struggling cafe to 4 happy clients. And the change was big. Enough to make me wonder why I'd spent so many years playing a small role in my own story. Martinez Cafe became my biggest success story. Rosa's bread sales tripled in the first month. More importantly, Rosa started telling everyone she knew about her amazing baker from Virginia. Word spread through Miami's tight restaurant community like gossip spreads through a small town. Suddenly my phone rang constantly with calls from cafe owners, restaurant managers, and even established bakeries who heard about the woman who could transform their bread programs into profit makers. I started Catherine's Baking Consulting from my little apartment. But within 2 months I needed real workspace. I found a shared commercial kitchen in Little Havana with professional equipment, plenty of space, and enough character to make clients feel special. My assistant was a smart 23-year-old named Maria Santos. She had business sense that rivaled most college graduates and could manage my schedule like a military commander. She just graduated from Florida International University and was working 3 part-time jobs when I hired her. Full-time. "Your 9 o'clock is here," Maria announced on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after I left Virginia. Jessica Chen from Downtown Dumplings. Jessica was exactly the type of client I'd become known for helping. Talented cook. Popular restaurant. But operations held together with hope and duct tape. Her dumpling restaurant was gaining customers faster than she could handle, but she was losing money on every order because her costs were out of control. "I heard you're the person to call when everything's falling apart," Jessica said, sitting across from me. My desk. "Well, everything's falling apart." For the next hour, Jessica painted a picture I'd seen before. Growing too fast without proper systems. Making food that customers loved but couldn't afford to produce profitably. buying ingredients at retail prices because she didn't know how to work with suppliers. Your ingredient costs are killing you, I told her after reviewing her numbers. You're spending 60% of revenue on food when it should be 30%. Every dumpling you sell loses money even though customers pay premium prices. But I can't charge more, Jessica protested. We're already expensive for this neighborhood. I leaned back in my chair, remembering similar conversations from my Virginia days. Jessica, what if I told you that better supplier relationships and proper inventory management could cut your costs by 40% without changing anything about your food? Her eyes got wide with hope. Is that real? Give me 6 weeks and I'll prove it. That project became my template for what I started calling the Catherine Method. Deep analysis of where money actually goes. Strategic partnerships with suppliers who give volume, discounts, implementation of inventory systems that prevent waste, and creation of procedures that work even when the owner isn't watching every detail. The results spoke clearly. Downtown Dumplings' food costs dropped to 32%. Their profit per dumpling increased by 60%. Their customer satisfaction stayed high because the food quality never changed. Jessica became another evangelist. Suddenly I was getting calls from restaurants in Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, and even back north in Georgia. By January I had 9 active clients and a waiting list that stretched into spring. I hired 2 more consultants, both experienced professionals who'd been underused by bigger companies. Sophie Williams was a former restaurant manager who'd been fired during budget cuts despite increasing her restaurant's profit by 40%. Marcus Johnson was a retired Navy cook who understood food service better than anyone I'd ever met. Together we were becoming something Miami's food scene had never seen. A consulting company that actually delivered real results instead of expensive advice that nobody could use. The money was incredible. In my first year in Miami, Catherine's baking consulting made more money than my share of Carter Family Bakery had ever produced. More importantly, every dollar was money I earned through my own work, not inherited through marriage or family connections. I celebrated my first anniversary in Florida by signing a lease on a bigger commercial kitchen and taking my whole team to the best seafood restaurant in Miami. As we sat around the table, celebrating with good wine and great food, Maria asked the question I'd been expecting for months. Catherine, do you ever miss Virginia? I thought about Brian, still running Carter Family Bakery with the same arrogance that drove me away. I thought about the house I'd shared with Thomas, now sold to strangers who would never know the dreams we planned at that kitchen table. I thought about the woman I'd been, always supporting other people's dreams instead of building her own. I miss who I thought I would become there, I said finally. But I don't miss who I actually was. Sophie raised her glass. To becoming exactly who we're meant to be. Our glasses clinked together. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown Virginia number. I looked at it and almost spit out my wine. Mom, I heard about your consulting business from Rosa Martinez. We need to talk. Brian. I showed the message to Maria, who read it with an expression usually reserved for finding a cockroach in your kitchen. How did he get Rosa's number? She asked. That was a good question. One that deserved a careful answer. Brian had clearly been tracking what I was doing, which meant he probably heard about Catherine's baking consulting's success. The question was whether he was calling because he needed help or because he wanted to make peace. Either way, I wasn't the same woman who walked out of that meeting room a year ago. The Catherine Carter who built a successful consulting company from nothing wasn't interested in playing small roles anymore. But she was very interested in seeing what her son wanted badly enough to track her down after a year of silence. I finished my wine and turned off my phone without answering. If Brian wanted to talk, he could wait until I decided I was ready to listen. After all, useless wait doesn't come running just because someone calls. Brian showed up at my commercial kitchen on a Wednesday morning in March, looking like success had been kicking him in the teeth. The confident young man who called me useless 2 years earlier had been replaced by someone with worry lines around his eyes and the desperate energy of a drowning man. I wasn't expecting him. Maria buzzed my office around 11 with barely hidden amusement in her voice. Catherine, there's a Brian Carter here to see you. He says he's your son. He doesn't have an appointment. And his attitude suggests he thinks that shouldn't matter. Perfect. Some things never change. Send him in, I said, closing the profit reports I'd been reviewing. Reports that showed Catherine's Baking Consulting now made more money than Carter Family Bakery ever had in its best year. Brian walked into my office like he owned it. But I could see hesitation underneath his confidence. He was wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the fact he'd lost weight in an unhealthy way. His eyes moved around my workspace with obvious surprise, taking in the professional kitchen equipment, the wall of thank you letters from clients, and the Miami skyline visible through large windows. Nice setup, Mom, he said, sitting in the chair across from my desk without being invited. Quite an upgrade from that little apartment Linda told me about. So he had been spying on me. Interesting. Hello, Brian, I replied calmly. 2 years of running my own business had taught me the value of staying quiet at the right moments. I'd say this is nice, but we both know I'd be lying. His fake smile looked more like a grimace. Can't a son visit his mother? A son can do whatever he wants, I said. The question is what this particular son wants badly enough to fly to Miami without warning. For a moment, his mask fell completely. Brian looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and about 10 years older than his 30 years. We're having problems at the bakery, he admitted. Nothing huge. Just some challenges with newer customers. Waited. 2 years of running my own company taught me that silence can be a powerful tool. Truth is, Brian continued, losing his confident tone, we've lost 5 major accounts in the last 4 months. Morrison's Market, the Daily Grind Cafe, and Sunshine Supermarkets all cancelled their contracts early. Those were all accounts I had personally managed for years. Customers whose needs I understood. Whose trust one earned through early morning deliveries and weekend emergency orders. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, meaning it. Not for Brian. But for Rita and the other employees whose jobs depended on keeping the business running. The thing is, Brian continued, these customers say they want to work with you personally. They've been following your work here in Miami. And they're impressed by what you've built. There it was. The real reason for his visit. What exactly are you suggesting, Brian? He leaned forward, putting on his negotiating face. Partnership. Carter Family Bakery and Catherine's Baking Consulting working together. We could share resources, combine clients, maybe even merge the companies eventually. I almost laughed. Almost. Let me make sure I understand, I said. 2 years ago, you called me useless and embarrassed me in front of our employees. Now you want a partner because those same employees are losing the customers I spent years taking care of. Look, I was young and dumb, okay? Brian's frustration showed. I made mistakes. But we're family. Family should help each other. Family, I repeated slowly. Brian, when I was crying about losing your father and trying to find my place in the company we built together, did you help me? I was trying to step up and take charge. You were trying to push me out so you could take credit for my work, I said. My voice stayed level but felt like steel. You succeeded. So what changed? Brian's shoulders sagged. Everything's harder than I thought. Dad made it look easy. And you? He paused, struggling with words. You always made it look effortless. I didn't realize how much of the customer management you handled. Finally, some honesty. Brian, I said gently, running a baking business isn't about looking successful in meetings. It's about solving problems other people can't solve. Building trust with customers who depend on you. Creating systems that work even when everything else goes wrong. I know that now, he said quietly. Will you think about it? The partnership. I stood up and walked to the window, looking at Miami's skyline. 2 years ago, this view didn't exist in my life. 2 years ago, I lived in someone else's shadow, grateful for whatever role they let me play. Now I was the owner of a business that never had a single unhappy client. I was teaching the next generation of food consultants. I was making more money than I ever dreamed possible. And more importantly, I was doing it all on my own. Brian, I said, turning to face him. I want you to do something for me. Hope appeared on his face. Anything. Think very carefully about what you're offering me. You want access to my clients, my methods, my reputation, and my skills. What exactly would I get from this partnership? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because from where I'm standing, I continued. You're asking me to fix the problems you created by getting rid of me. You're asking me to repair relationships with customers you drove away. You're asking me to save the business you insisted you could run better without your useless mother. The silence felt heavy. I built Catherine's Baking Consulting from nothing, I said finally. No family connections. No inherited customer list. No husband's reputation. Just my own skills and hard work. Why would I give up my independence to fix someone else's mess? Brian stared at me with something that might have been respect mixed with desperation. What would it take? He asked quietly. That's when I smiled. The kind of smile that comes from finally being the one with power in a game you were losing. Brian, I said, there's nothing you have that I need. But there might be something I have that you need. I walked back to my desk and pulled out a business card. When you're ready to hire Catherine's Baking Consulting as a regular contractor at our normal rates to help fix what you broke, call Maria to schedule an appointment. She handles all my new client requests. The look on his face was worth every moment of pain I felt 2 years earlier. You're treating me like any other customer, he asked, shocked. Brian, I said, walking to my office door and opening it. You are just another customer. The question is whether you're going to be a successful one. As he stood to leave, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The pure joy of being needed by someone who threw me away. And having the power to set the rules. Useless wait indeed. Brian hired Catherine's Baking Consulting 3 weeks later. Watching him sign our standard contract was almost as satisfying as my first 6-figure revenue quarter. Almost. Because the best revenge is always professional success served with a side of justice. The contract signing happened in my office with Maria handling the paperwork like the professional she'd become. Brian sat across from me looking like someone who swallowed his pride and found it tasted exactly as bitter as expected. Standard rate is $60 per hour, Maria explained, sliding papers across the table. Minimum contract is 50 hours. Payment due within 2 weeks, not 30. Brian's pen stopped over the signature line. 60. That's higher than you quoted on the phone. Market rates, I said calmly. Miami's economy has been very good to us. What I didn't mention was that our standard rate for new clients was actually $50 per hour. But Brian wasn't just any client. He was the client who taught me that family discounts are just another way of saying your work isn't valuable. He signed. The next morning I flew to Virginia for the first time in 2 years. Getting off the plane felt like visiting a past life. Complete with familiar humidity that reminded me why I left. Carter Family Bakery was in the same building it always occupied. But something felt different the moment I walked through the front door. The young woman at the counter, someone I didn't recognize, looked stressed and tired. The display cases that used to be full now showed gaps and empty spaces. A general feeling of barely controlled chaos hung in the air. Rita met me at the stairs. The relief on her face was both satisfying and sad. Catherine, she said, hugging me like I'd returned from the dead. Thank God you're here. As we walked upstairs to the office, Rita filled me in on what Brian had been too proud to admit during his Miami visit. We've lost more than just those big accounts, she said quietly. Morrison's Market was just the start. Word got out that you weren't with the company anymore. Customers started questioning whether we could deliver the same quality. How bad is it? Revenue is down 55% from 2 years ago. We've had to let go of 8 people, including Tom from packaging and Maria from customer service. Those names hit like punches. Tom had been with us for 6 years. Maria had 3 kids at home. Brian's been trying to get new customers, Rita continued. But he struggles with the consultation process. He can identify problems but can't design solutions the way you did. The elevator doors opened onto the floor that used to feel like home. Now it felt like a place where someone murdered efficiency and left confusion to rot. Brian was waiting with the 3 remaining managers. Mark, Patricia, and James. All people I'd hired and trained. Myself. All right, I said, settling into my old chair at the table. Let's see what we're dealing with. For the next 3 hours they showed me their current customer situations. Each presentation was worse than the last. Orders running late. Customers complaining about quality. Solutions that fixed surface problems but missed the real issues. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery with a spoon. The Henderson Hotel project, I said, interrupting Mark's explanation of why their bread delivery program was 4 weeks behind schedule. What was your first assessment of their main problem? Mark looked through his notes. Inefficient morning prep leading to late deliveries. Wrong, I said simply. Their prep is fine. Their problem is batch sizing. They're making too much of some breads and not enough of others. They're solving the wrong problem, which is why your solution isn't working. The room went silent. Patricia leaned forward. How could you know that without visiting their kitchen? Because I helped them set up their original ordering system 3 years ago. And I've seen this exact issue with 4 other clients who have similar breakfast programs. Brian's face looked like someone watching their house burn while realizing they forgot to buy insurance. The West Side Cafe project, I continued, turning to James. Me guess. You recommended they hire more baking staff to increase production. Yes, that was our main suggestion. And how's that working? James looked uncomfortable. They're experiencing some budget concerns. Course they are, James. West Side's problem isn't staffing. It's that their oven temperature is inconsistent, so they're wasting 30% of every batch. You can't fix equipment problems by hiring more people. For every project they presented, I could spot the basic flaw in minutes. Not because I was smarter, but because I had years of experience seeing these patterns. And Brian never bothered to learn the diagnostic skills that make baking consulting actually work. As the day ended, Brian asked to talk privately. How did things get this bad? He asked once we were alone in his office. Thomas's old office, I noticed. Though Brian had redecorated with modern furniture that somehow made the space feel colder. Brian, I said, consulting isn't just about knowing baking. It's about pattern recognition, diagnostic thinking, the ability to see systems instead of symptoms. Those skills take years to develop. Dad made it look easy. Your father spent 20 years learning to make it look easy, I said. And even then, he relied on me for customer relationship management because he understood his strengths were in sales, not problem solving. Brian slumped in his chair. What do I do now? For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to come to me when his school projects weren't working, trusting Mom could fix anything. But this wasn't a school project. And I wasn't just Mom anymore. You have 3 choices, I said. Choice 1. Hire me for 4 months to redesign your consulting approach and properly train your team. Cost about $40,000 with no promise your remaining customers will stay long enough to see results. His face went white. Choice 2. Sell Carter Family Bakery to a competitor while you still have something worth buying. Choice 3. I stood and gathered my notes. Choice 3. Keep doing what you're doing and be out of business within a year. As I headed for the door, Brian called after me. Catherine, if I choose option 1, would you consider staying permanently? Maybe taking over as boss again? I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. 2 years ago that offer would have meant everything. Now it just sounded like someone asking me to clean up their mess. Brian, I said without turning around. Already am a boss. The question is whether you're ready to become a student. That evening I had dinner with Rita at our old favorite restaurant. Over wine and pasta, she told me things Brian hadn't mentioned during his Miami visit. Catherine, there's something you need to know, she said quietly. Brian took out a big loan against the bakery last year. If we lose any more major customers, we might not be able to make payments. The picture became clearer. And it wasn't pretty. Brian hadn't just damaged the company through bad decisions. He'd made financial choices that put everyone's jobs at risk. How big? He asked. $200,000. I nearly choked on my wine. For what? Office renovation. New equipment. A marketing campaign that never actually launched properly. Rita's voice was bitter. He wanted everything to look successful while the actual business was dying. As I flew back to Miami the next morning, I realized Brian's visit hadn't been about partnership. It had been about desperation dressed up as family reconciliation. But here's the thing about desperation. It makes people willing to pay premium prices for solutions to problems they created. And after 2 years of building my own empire, I was very good at solving other people's problems for the right price. Fixing Carter Family Bakery turned out to be like performing surgery on a patient who kept insisting they only had a headache. Every solution revealed 3 new problems. Each problem traced back to decisions Brian made while thinking he was being smart. I spent the next month traveling between Miami and Virginia, living in hotels and charging Brian's company for every hour, every meal, and every mile. Professional courtesy is one thing. Paying for someone else's education in humility is another. The loan situation was worse than Rita initially told me. Brian hadn't just borrowed against company property. He'd personally promised to pay the debt, which meant if Carter Family Bakery failed, he'd lose his house, his savings, and his kids' college money. "Why didn't you tell me about the personal promise?" I asked during our 3rd week of intensive customer recovery. We were sitting in the conference room at 8 p.m. surrounded by spreadsheets showing just how badly he'd mismanaged everything I spent decades building. "I didn't think it mattered," Brian said, loosening his tie with shaking hands. "I was confident we could fix things." Brian, when you're responsible for other people's jobs, confidence is not a business plan. The personal promise explained why he'd been so desperate to get me back. This wasn't about professional embarrassment anymore. It was about financial survival. But as I dug deeper into recent company history, I discovered something that made my blood boil. "Janet," I said, pulling her aside after our morning meeting, "walk me through the Morrisons market cancellation again. Specifically what Brian told them about why I left." Rita looked uncomfortable. "Catherine, I don't think." "Rita," I said firmly. She sighed. "He told them you'd had some kind of breakdown after Thomas died. That you'd become unreliable. That the family had to make the difficult choice to remove you from customer management for everyone's safety." The room tilted. "He told our customers I had a breakdown. He said it was early memory loss. That you'd been showing signs of confusion. That the company had to protect customers from getting bad advice. 25 years of marriage to Thomas taught me how to stay calm during crisis. 20 years of business taught me how to separate feelings from facts." But sitting in that conference room, hearing Rita describe how my son destroyed my professional reputation to cover his mistakes, I felt something break inside my chest. "Catherine," Rita's voice seemed far away. "Are you okay?" Was not okay. I was furious with a clarity that felt like stepping out of fog into bright sunlight. "Rita, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Names, dates, exact words if possible. I want it documented." That evening I called my lawyer in Miami. Patricia Rodriguez had been handling my business legal work since I started Catherine's baking consulting. She had the kind of sharp mind that made opposing lawyers wish they'd chosen different careers. "Catherine, what you're describing could be defamation," Patricia said after I explained. "Telling customers you're mentally impaired when you're actually a competitor could be grounds for a serious lawsuit." "I'm not interested in suing my son," I said. "But I am interested in making sure he understands consequences." "What kind of consequences?" I looked out my hotel window at Virginia's skyline, thinking about the woman who'd been so desperate for family approval that she accepted being called useless without fighting back. That woman was gone. The kind that teach people not to lie about their mother's mental health to cover their failures, I said. The next morning I called an all-staff meeting. Every remaining employee of Carter Family Bakery gathered in the main room, including people I'd hired, trained, and worked beside for years. Brian introduced me as our consulting specialist, helping us through some temporary challenges. I let him finish his cleaned-up version of reality before standing up. "Thank you, Brian. For those who don't know, I'm Catherine Carter. I founded this company 28 years ago with my late husband Thomas. I looked around at faces showing confusion, hope, and sometimes embarrassment. I understand there's been confusion about why I'm no longer with Carter Family Bakery full-time. Brian's face went pale. Mom, I don't think. I left, I continued, because my son told me I was useless during a meeting and suggested the company would be better without me. I moved to Miami, started my own consulting business, and built it into a more successful operation than Carter has ever been. You could have heard a pin drop. I'm here now because Brian hired my company to help fix the problems created by my absence. Over the next month we'll be implementing new systems, retraining staff, and rebuilding customer relationships damaged by poor management. I turned to look directly at Brian. But first, I think it's important everyone understands exactly what happened and why, so we can make sure it never happens again. For the next 10 minutes, I laid out the truth. Not meanly, but with the same careful precision I used to analyze business problems. The embarrassment in the meeting room. The lies told to customers about my mental health. The financial decisions that put everyone's jobs at risk. When I finished, the room was silent except for the sound of Brian's career plans falling apart. Any questions? Yes. Patricia raised her hand carefully. Catherine, are you coming back permanently? No, I said. I'm here to fix a mess, train you all to avoid making similar messes, and then return to my actual company in Miami. Mark spoke up. What happens to us after you leave? That depends on whether you learn from this or repeat it. As the meeting ended, employees approached me. Individually. Some to apologize for not speaking up during that original meeting. Others to ask if my Miami company was hiring. A few to express relief that finally someone was going to fix what was broken. Brian cornered me as I packed my notes. That was completely unnecessary, he said. His voice tight with anger and embarrassment. Brian, I replied calmly. Everything I said was true. If you find truth unnecessary, that tells me everything about how you've been running this company. You embarrassed me in front of my employees. I stopped gathering my papers and looked directly at him. Yes, I said. I did. How did that feel? The recognition on his face told me he was finally starting to understand what he put me through 2 years earlier. Now, I continued, let's see if you can learn from embarrassment the way I did. Because if you can't, this company really is beyond saving. That night, I sat in my hotel room and did something I hadn't done since leaving Virginia. I let myself cry. Not for the company. Not for the damaged relationships. But for the years I spent being smaller than I was capable of being. But sadness, I'd learned, could be fuel if you used it right. And I had a month of intensive teaching to deliver to a son who was about to discover what useless weight could do when it decided to become the foundation instead of the burden. Teaching your own son that he doesn't know everything is more exhausting than rebuilding an entire business from scratch. By week 3 of the Carter Family Bakery rehabilitation, I was starting to understand why some animals abandon their young. Brian had agreed to shadow me during customer recovery calls, which meant he got to see firsthand how professional relationships actually work when they're built on skill instead of inherited authority. Our first joint customer meeting was with Morrison's Market. Rebecca Morrison agreed to hear our pitch for renewed business, though her first email had been what polite people call cautiously doubtful. Catherine, Rebecca said as we settled into her office. I have to admit I was surprised to hear you were back with Carter. Brian told us. You'd been having health problems. I glanced at Brian, who suddenly found his notebook fascinating. Rebecca, I've never been healthier or more professionally engaged. I spent the last 2 years building a consulting practice in Miami that's been extremely successful. Brian hired my company to help restructure Carter's operations. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. Your company. Catherine's Baking Consulting. We specialize in exactly the type of systematic problem-solving Morrison's Market needs. For the next hour, I walked Rebecca through detailed analysis of her company's current challenges, complete with specific recommendations building on work we'd done together 3 years earlier. Brian sat silently, taking notes and occasionally looking like he wanted to speak but couldn't find an opening. This is exactly what we needed 18 months ago, Rebecca said when I finished. Why didn't Carter Family Bakery provide this level of analysis then? The question hung in the air like smoke. Because, I said carefully, the person who developed these methods was no longer available to use them. Rebecca nodded, slowly understanding more than I was saying. And now? Now Catherine's Baking Consulting is available on contract to provide exactly these services. We left that meeting with a signed contract worth $50,000. Not for Carter Family Bakery, but for Catherine's Baking Consulting, with Carter handling only the administrative work. Brian was quiet during the drive back, but I could see him thinking. She would have signed 18 months ago if I'd known how to present the analysis, he said finally. How many other customers would have stayed if I'd understood how to maintain the relationships you built? I thought about the dozens of calls I'd received over 2 years from former Carter customers who heard about my Miami practice and wanted to work with me directly. Most of them, I said. That evening, Brian asked me to dinner at the restaurant where Thomas and I used to celebrate big wins. As we sat across from each other in a booth I'd shared with his father countless times, Brian asked the question I'd been expecting for weeks. What would it take for you to come back permanently? Sipped my wine and thought about how to answer honestly without being cruel. Brian, coming back permanently would require me to give up a company I built from scratch, move away from a city I love, and work for someone who spent 2 years telling people I was mentally incompetent. What exactly would motivate me to make those sacrifices? Family, he said immediately. This is Dad's company. Our company. No, I said gently. This was Dad's and my company. You made it clear 2 years ago you considered it your company and me an obstacle. You can't change that decision now just because you need help. David's shoulders sagged. I was wrong. I was arrogant and stupid and made terrible decisions. But we're family. Families forgive. I have forgiven you, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending consequences don't exist. You destroyed customer relationships, damaged employee morale, made financial commitments you couldn't honor. Those are business problems, not family problems. So you'll just let the company fail. The question showed everything I needed to know about how Brian still saw things. In his mind, I was responsible for saving what he broke simply because I was his mother. Brian, I said, I've already saved the company. Catherine's Baking Consulting now holds the contracts that keep Carter Family Bakery alive. Your employees have jobs because my company generates the revenue paying their salaries. But it's not the same. No, it's not. It's better. It's a sustainable business model based on actual skill instead of inherited relationships. The next week brought news that changed everything. Patricia knocked on my hotel room door at 6 in the morning with an expression suggesting either very good news or very bad news. Catherine, you need to see this, she said, handing me a printout of an email. The email was from Bradley Morrison, Rebecca's husband and Morrison's market operations manager. The subject line said confidential information about Carter Family Bakery. The message was short but devastating. Catherine, thought you should know Brian Carter approached 3 of our current suppliers last month. Offered to provide consulting services identical to what your Miami company delivers. He presented materials that appeared to be your methods and claimed he developed them. 2 suppliers expressed interest in switching from their current consultants to Carter. Thought you should be aware. I read the email 3 times, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Brian hadn't just been incompetent. He'd been actively trying to steal my business methods and pass them off as his own. Patricia, I said quietly, I need you to gather documentation on every method, process, and system I've developed since leaving Carter. Everything. That belongs to Catherine's Baking Consulting. You think he's been copying your work? I think my son has been trying to steal my intellectual property while I've been helping him save his company. That afternoon I confronted Brian in his office. I laid Bradley's email on his desk and watched his face confirm everything I needed to know. Brian, I said, we need to discuss your understanding of property law. It's not what it looks like, he said. But his voice carried guilt. What it looks like is theft. What it looks like is you taking methods I developed for my company and presenting them as your own to steal my clients. You developed those methods while working here originally. I developed them for Catherine's baking consulting using my time, my resources, and my skills. They belong to me, not you. Brian's face flushed with anger and shame. Everything you know you learned working for this company. Everything you know you learned from me, I replied evenly. The difference is I'm not trying to steal credit for your work. As I walked out of his office, I realized our month-long rehabilitation had just become something else. A lesson in why some people never learn that shortcuts don't lead to success. They just lead to deeper holes. The call from my lawyer came at 5:30 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I discovered Brian's theft. Patricia Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of excitement that meant either very good news for me or very bad news for someone else. Catherine, you need to get to my office immediately. I've discovered something about Brian's loan that changes everything. I'd been planning to return to Miami that weekend. My contracted month with Carter Family Bakery nearly done. The company was stable. Employees were retrained. 3 major customers renewed contracts with Catherine's baking consulting. Brian seemed to accept the new reality where he ran paperwork while I controlled actual consulting. Apparently I'd been naive. Patricia's office overlooked the river. On clear days you could see the mountains. But that morning thick clouds blocked everything, which seemed fitting for what I was about to learn. Catherine, Patricia said, sliding a thick folder across her desk. You know how we researched Brian's $200,000 loan to understand your liability. You said company property was collateral, not my personal assets. That's what I thought. But buried in the loan paperwork is something called a family succession clause. It's unusual language I've never seen in standard business loans. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. What does that mean? It means if Brian defaults and if the company transfers to another family member within 3 years of the loan, that family member becomes personally responsible for the debt. The room tilted. Patricia, I don't own any part of Carter Family Bakery. I gave up my shares when I left. That's where it gets interesting, Patricia said, opening another folder. Brian never filed paperwork to officially transfer your shares. According to state records, you still own 25% of Carter Family Bakery. I stared at her. That's impossible. I signed papers. You signed intent to transfer. But actual transfer was never completed with the state. Which means legally you're still part owner of a company owing $200,000. The implications hit like a physical blow. If Brian's loan went into default, I would be legally responsible for debt I never agreed to, secured by a company I thought I no longer owned. Patricia, I said carefully, what happens if Brian declares bankruptcy? The succession clause kicks in automatically. Your Miami assets, or house, your business accounts, everything would be available for debt collection. Sat back, processing the magnitude of what Brian had done. He hadn't just been stealing my methods and trying to poach my clients. He'd structured his loan to make me financially responsible if his company failed. How long have you known? I discovered it yesterday reviewing final documents. Catherine, there's more. She pulled out more papers. Brian took out the loan 12 months ago. 2 months after you'd established Catherine's baking consulting and started making significant money. The timing suggests this was planned. Planned how? Think about it. He pushes you. Waits for you to become financially successful elsewhere. Then structures debt that transfers to you if his business fails. If Carter goes under, you become responsible for his mistakes while he walks away clean. The coffee cup fell from my hands, shattering on the floor. Patricia moved to clean it, but I sat frozen, staring at loan documents revealing just how calculating my son had been. Catherine, Patricia said gently, I think Brian's been planning to bankrupt Carter Family Bakery and stick you with the debt from the beginning. Everything fell into place with sickening clarity. Brian's visit to Miami hadn't been about reconciliation, had been scouting. He needed to verify I was financially successful enough to cover his debts before he pulled the trigger. The consulting contract, the month of rehabilitation, even this morning's revelation. all designed to put me in perfect position to become financially liable for $200,000 of debt I never agreed to. What are my options? Yes. Legally, you can demand immediate completion of share transfer to remove your ownership. But if Carter is already insolvent, transferring ownership might trigger the succession clause anyway. And if I don't transfer, then you're part owner of a company about to default on a massive loan. I stood and walked to Patricia's window, looking at Virginia's gray sky that suddenly matched my mood perfectly. Patricia, what if Carter Family Bakery became profitable enough to service the loan payments? That would require significant money infusion or dramatic revenue increase. How significant? At minimum, $100,000 in new business over the next year. Turned back to face her, feeling something sharp and cold forming in my chest. What if Catherine's Baking Consulting merged with Carter Family Bakery, with me as majority owner and boss? Patricia's eyebrows rose. That would certainly generate sufficient revenue. But Catherine, why would you want to take over a company your son used to trap you financially? The answer came with perfect clarity. Because sometimes the best way to escape a trap is to spring it yourself on your own terms. That afternoon I called Brian and asked him to meet at the office. He arrived. I had all loan documentation spread across the table like evidence at trial. Brian, I said as he sat, we need to discuss your understanding of family loyalty. He looked at the papers and his face went white. Mom, I can explain. Can you? Can you explain why you took out a loan designed to make me financially responsible for your failures? Can you explain why you never completed my share transfer so I'd still be legally liable for company debts? It wasn't supposed to happen this way, he said weakly. How was it supposed to happen, Brian? The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Finally he looked up with the expression of someone caught. I thought you'd come back, he whispered. I thought if the company was in enough trouble, you'd have to come back and fix it. I never meant for you to be hurt financially. Brian, I said gently, what you meant doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you did. I stood and gathered loan documents. Tomorrow I'm filing paperwork to assume majority control of Carter Family Bakery. I'm restructuring the debt, reorganizing operations, and merging both companies under new management. You're taking over. I'm taking back what was always mine, I said. The only question is whether you'll stay as an employee or leave voluntarily. As I walked toward the door, Brian called after me. Mom, what if I refuse? What if I fight the takeover? I paused and turned back. Brian, I said with a smile that felt like ice. Useless weight doesn't get to choose whether it sinks or swims. But it can choose whether it goes down quietly or makes a scene that embarrasses everyone. 24 hours later, I owned 60% of Carter Family Bakery. And my son was learning what it felt like to work for someone who didn't confuse family relationships with business competence. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming successful enough to save the people who tried to destroy you. For months after Brian's loan trap exploded in his face, I stood in the main hall of Carter Catherine Baking Solutions, the newly merged powerhouse combining the best of both my companies, watching Virginia's food industry leaders applaud my presentation on sustainable growth through authentic leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated for success that grew directly from my son's attempt to financially destroy me. Brian sat in the back row wearing the expression of someone who learned that trying to outsmart your mother is like challenging a chess master to checkers. You might think you understand the game, but you're not even playing the same sport. After the presentation, Rebecca Morrison approached with champagne and the kind of smile that comes from watching justice served with professional excellence. Catherine, she said, raising her glass. When I heard you'd taken over Carter, I wasn't sure what to expect. This exceeds anything I imagined. She was right to be impressed. In 4 months, I transformed a failing bakery into the Mid-Atlantic's most sought-after baking solutions company. Revenue increased by 200%. Employee retention was 96%. Customer satisfaction scores were higher than anything the industry had seen. More importantly, I'd done it while carrying the $200,000 debt Brian tried to trap me with. Every loan payment became a reminder that financial traps only work if you can't generate enough success to turn them into stepping stones. Mrs. Carter, a young reporter from Virginia Business Review, appeared at my elbow. "Could I ask about your remarkable comeback story?" Of course, I said, though I was starting to understand that what media called a comeback was actually just the story of a woman who finally stopped letting other people define her worth. "Is it true your son originally forced you out of the company you founded?" "My son made a business decision based on incomplete information," I replied diplomatically. "It ultimately led to opportunities neither of us anticipated. And now he works for you." I glanced toward the back where Brian was talking with one of our new consultants. Over the past 4 months, he'd slowly begun learning skills he should have developed years earlier. How to listen to customers. How to analyze problems systematically. How to design solutions that actually solve root causes instead of just fixing surface problems. "Brian is learning the business the way everyone should," I said. "From the ground up with no shortcuts." That evening, I sat in my new office, Thomas's old office, which I'd reclaimed and redecorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture that actually invited collaboration, reviewing quarterly reports showing just how spectacular our growth had been. A knock on my door interrupted my review. Brian stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was 10 and broke my favorite vase-playing ball in the house. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He handed me coffee and settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone unsure of their welcome. "Catherine," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "Mom, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months." "Take your time. I was wrong about everything. About you. About the business. About what leadership actually means." He paused, staring into his coffee. "I thought being boss meant making decisions and having people follow them. I didn't understand it meant taking responsibility for everyone who trusted you." I waited, sensing more. "When I set up that loan structure, when I tried to trap you financially, I told myself it was strategy. That I was being clever. Finding a way to force you back." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "But the truth is I was scared. Scared that without you I'd fail. Instead of admitting that, I tried to manipulate you into saving me." "Brian," I said gently, "fear makes people do terrible things to people they love. The question is what you do after realizing how terrible those things were." "What I'm doing is learning from the best teacher I ever had," he said. "Even if it took me 30 years to figure out I should have been paying attention." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee and watching the Virginia skyline light up as evening settled. "Catherine," Brian said finally, "do you think you'll ever really forgive me?" I thought about the woman who walked out of this office 3 years earlier, humiliated and dismissed and convinced her best years were behind her. Then I thought about the woman who walked back in 4 months ago as owner of the most successful baking consulting company in the Mid-Atlantic. "Brian," I said, "I forgave you the moment I realized your worst decision led to my best life." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you hadn't called me useless and pushed me out, I never would have discovered what I was capable of building alone. I never would have learned that being discarded by people you love doesn't reduce your value. It just reveals how much they underestimated what they were throwing away." Brian's eyes filled with tears. "So you're grateful I sabotaged you?" "I'm grateful you gave me permission to stop making myself smaller to fit other people's expectations," I said. "I'm grateful you forced me to discover that a woman called useless weight can still build an empire. Especially when she stops carrying anyone else's baggage." 3 years ago my son embarrassed me in front of a room full of people and told me I was worthless. Today those same people worked for me. And the company Brian thought he could run without me was thriving under my leadership. But the real victory wasn't professional success or financial security, or even the satisfaction of proving Brian wrong. The real victory was looking in the mirror each morning and seeing Catherine Carter. Not Thomas's widow. Not Brian's mother. Not someone defined by relationships to other people. But a woman who learned that being discarded was sometimes the first step toward discovering your actual worth. As Brian left my office that evening, he paused in the doorway. "Mom," he said, What would you have done if I'd never called you back to help? I smiled, thinking about the thriving Miami office, the clients who followed me from Virginia, and the life I built from absolute scratch. Brian, I said, I would have kept building my empire and never looked back. The only difference is now I get to run both companies instead of just one. After he left, I poured myself wine and stood at my office window, looking at the city where I'd been dismissed as useless 3 years earlier. Tomorrow the Virginia Times would run a feature story about Carter Catherine Baking Solutions' meteoric rise with my photo on the business section's front page. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just becoming so successful that the people who discarded you end up working for you and grateful for the opportunity. And sometimes when you're sipping wine in the boss's office of the company your son tried to steal from you, useless weight turns out to be the perfect foundation for building something magnificent. Thanks for watching Granny's Voice. Don't forget to subscribe and share your story in the comments. Your voice matters too.